The House of Commons isn't sitting this week, but there's still lots to talk about with the At Issue panel. Andrew is in Toronto, Jennifer Ditchburn and Paul Wells join us from Ottawa this week. So let's start with one of the topics that has been dominating the headlines, and that's the death of John Ridsdale. As we've all learned now, the ransom was certainly not paid to the liking of the people who've been holding him and are still holding others. But it raises the question of Canada's policy on paying ransoms. And before we get into what the Prime Minister talked about this week and Canada's policy in his government, I want to talk about what we think the policy has been, in fact, in governments past. And so, Andrew, let me start with you. The government of Canada, whoever's been there, has always said we don't pay ransoms. But has that been a public policy and we've been doing something differently behind the scenes?
By all accounts, yes, and we're not alone in that regard. Every government proclaims that they're not going to pay ransom, and virtually all of them do. We've had our share, of course, the famous case being the diplomats Fowler and Gay in 2009, who were held for 130 days. Again, the Prime Minister at the time, Stephen Harper, said we didn't pay any ransom for it. It's since emerged from intercepted diplomatic cables and internal communications within the terrorist group that held him, that in fact something in the order of $1 million was paid through intermediaries. There's never our fingerprints on it, but ultimately the money gets there. And by all accounts, that was not an isolated case. It was more or less standard practice.
So, Paul, that idea of a third party, an intermediary, is that how a government can square saying one thing publicly and doing something else?
It certainly is. And there's this stark difference between what we're hearing out of the Trudeau government and what we're hearing from retired diplomats, including this gentleman, Gar Party, who claims to have brokered the release of more than 100 hostages by arranging payment to the hostage takers. What I hear repeatedly, emphatically from sources around Justin Trudeau is that that's not the case with this government, that the Prime Minister was adamant since soon after the election last fall, as soon as this came up in briefings, that not a cent was to be paid to hostage takers either directly or indirectly. And the current government actually hasn't been able to ascertain what was the practice of the previous government. So good was Stephen Harper at covering his tracks. But they insist that this is their practice and they're going to stick to it.
All right, let's get then to what the Prime Minister said this week on this very point. Now, I would ask the audience to listen most closely to the final words, the final phrase in what he had to say.
Canada does not and will not pay ransom to terrorists, directly or indirectly.
So, Jennifer, I want you to pick up on that point. Does that, in your view, signal a change? Because he does seem to be speaking, if not directly or indirectly, to the point that maybe this has been going on behind the scenes.
Absolutely, and we're given to understand that stuff was happening in the back channels. So I think this is definitely a change of policy, but I'm left wanting more. I mean, obviously, this is a really complex issue with a lot of nuance. So, for example, we're not going to pay Al-Qaeda or ISIS offshoots, but will we pay to get the release of Canadian business people who are kidnapped in Latin America, which is very common, far more common than being kidnapped in the Middle East, for example? What about if a child was kidnapped? What about if somebody that the Canadian government had a duty to protect was kidnapped, like a diplomat or somebody in the Canadian forces that they were supposed to be protecting, a politician that's on a trip, if they were kidnapped, would they just sort of wipe their hands and say, well, we don't deal with terrorists? I find that sort of hard to believe, and I'd like to know a little bit more about the whole policy and what it entails.
So, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind picking up on that point, what should the policy be?
Well, the reason for the policy that other governments have always announced of we're not going to pay ransom is we don't want to give the incentive to hostage takers to take more hostages. And we also don't want to give them money with which to do whatever it is terrorists want to do, kill people or kidnap more people. The question is, how far are you going to go with that? Mr. Trudeau has taken this now further, at least in rhetoric, than we've seen before. He's going to say not only directly but indirectly, i.e. we're not going to play this game of having intermediaries pay on our behalf. But if we're really serious about preventing terrorists from getting that money, the question becomes, how far are you going to go? Are you going to allow the families of the kidnapped victims to pay ransom? Because if so, that money is being sent to the hostage takers. Are you going to allow the game of other governments filling the void where we're not. If we're not willing to pay ransom to kidnappers, is France or other countries going to be willing to do so? It's much more than just the government of Canada's problem, much more than its responsibility, and I think we really have to be quite clear-headed about how far we're prepared to go on this to deny the kidnappers the oxygen of the money that people are paying them.
Paul, I wanted to bring you in on this because, I mean, I think everybody would agree it's a horrible dilemma for any government, any politician to be in. You really are damned if you do, damned if you don't.
It is also one that Justin Trudeau has had occasion to think about for quite literally all his life. The classic kidnapping case in Canada happened a year before he was born, during the October crisis of 1970, when Pierre Trudeau had to respond to the kidnappings of James Cross, the British diplomat, and Pierre Laporte, the Quebec Justice Minister, who was later murdered. I'm told there were long conversations about these issues within the Trudeau family when Justin Trudeau was still quite young, and he had decided on his policy before he became Prime Minister on this. And he's not alone. The UK Prime Minister is said to be very close to Justin Trudeau's thinking on this, and we shouldn't be surprised if we hear about these issues during the G7 summit next month.
But Jennifer, I know you have your own personal take on this as well.
Well, I find it interesting what's happening in the United States. They have a hostage recovery fusion center where they bring all kinds of different agencies together to coordinate their response to hostage taking. And part of that is a center that deals with the families. And yeah, 20 years ago, a relative of mine was kidnapped with his child in Guatemala. And I can tell you it causes great anguish for families. And so I think that a good thing for the Trudeau government, too, would be to say, this is what we're going to do for families. This is the response that we're going to have. If we're not going to pay ransoms, well, we're going to do everything we can militarily, with public safety, with all these different agencies to make sure that we get the return of your loved one. We're not just going to sit on our hands if your loved one is kidnapped. And I would just add to that with what Andrew was saying. I mean, not all of these groups are part of some massive network. As I was mentioning before, some are just business people that are working in the field and mining or wherever around the world. And so sometimes the matter of paying ransom isn't just, you're not funding a huge multinational criminal organization, but just some petty criminals. So that's where I was saying it's a very nuanced issue.
And just before we move on to the next topic, Andrew, I mean, how do you tell families not to get involved in this? I don't know how you'd tell them, don't try to do everything you can, even if it may work against the greater good.
Absolutely. It is a cruel dilemma for anybody in power, and even crueler for those families. But this is why, and this comes up in a lot of times of policy questions, where if we leave it to individual people to make their choices, they're going to make one choice which is perfectly understandable to them. But if it has consequences for everyone else, if the consequence is to encourage more kidnappings, more victims, more hostage takings in future, then that's where the government has to step in and make policy that's for the greater good. And as harsh as that sounds, I don't see any way of getting away from that.
All right, let's change topics and move to something that, is lighthearted, I guess, depending on your perspective. But Donald Trump certainly finds his way into headlines and every conversation. He's describing himself now as the presumptive Republican nominee, and I think increasingly that's seeming likely. So, Jennifer, does Ottawa need to change the way it's been speaking about him, the way it's been engaging or not with him?
That's a tough one because I think there's a political upside to kind of being against Trump. He's not very, well, he's very unpopular in Canada, let's just put it that way. And if you kind of put yourself in contrast to him, as Justin Trudeau I think naturally is, I think that sort of probably resonates with the Canadian public. I mean, at the same time, if there's any chance that he's going to be the president, then yes, there's going to have to be a sort of softening of rhetoric. But also on Donald Trump's side, I think we can expect his rhetoric, I mean, hopefully, will soften the closer he gets to the real race, in which he'll have to be attracting many more people than just in the Republican Party. So I think there'll be some water and wine on both sides of the border.
Okay, let's listen to him for just a moment, because he did have his grand foreign policy unveiling earlier this week. It's been a little thin on specifics. Some would argue it was still thin on specifics afterward. But he did seem to make one point over and over again. Let's listen to that.
My foreign policy will always put the interests of the American people and American security above all else. Has to be first. Americans must know that we're putting the American people first again. The American worker will always be my first priority.
I don't know if everybody caught that, America first. Andrew, I mean, do we have to be worried at all about that kind of a policy? He doesn't like NAFTA. I mean, he seems to like less the role that Mexico plays in Canada, but doesn't like TPP. It's America first, American workers first. Let's presume he moves this all the way to the White House. What then?
Well, of course, the phrase America First has unfortunate antecedents. It was a rather nasty movement in the 1930s, very nativist and worse. I don't know what president didn't or hasn't put America's interests first. If they were, it'd be an odd. If they weren't, it'd be an odd job for them to be taking. In his case, it seems to suggest a kind of a retreat into quasi-isolationism to the extent it has any coherent basis at all. He seems very down on NATO, for example, which is one of the bulwarks of the post-war order. I still think it is rather premature to be talking through what we do in terms of a Trump presidency. He's far from cinching even the Republican nomination. If he loses in Indiana, for example, he'll have to do very well in California to win it before the convention. If they get into a contested convention, all bets are off. And if you look at the numbers in the polls, Hillary Clinton has a 55% negative rating. That would usually rule you out as a candidate, but Trump has a 70% unfavorable rating. It is very hard to see how he could overcome the kinds of antipathy towards him amongst Hispanic voters, amongst women voters, amongst black voters. He'd have to get 80% of the white male vote. That's not going to happen. So he's a long way we're a long way from having to deal with President Trump just yet.
Having said that, Paul, I guess we'll be giving the last word to you on Trump. A lot of people counted him out before now. He's still there. So, in politics, who knows? Does Ottawa need to start thinking about how they'll deal with him, even in the intervening months, if he does win the nomination?
I think whoever the next president is going to be a challenge for Justin Trudeau. If it were Trump, I'll play along, although I promise you it will not be him. Then he's going to spend at least the first year or so of a Trump administration vanishing into a sinkhole of nativism and resentment against all of America's neighbors. Justin Trudeau can benefit from playing along. He could essentially campaign against President Donald Trump for a year without suffering much domestic blowback for that policy, because most Canadians would agree with it. If Hillary Clinton is the president, it's a little more complicated. She's a Democrat, he's a liberal, they're supposed to get along. But when she was a senator for New York State, which is a border state, her rhetoric was not that different from Donald Trump's on putting American workers first and to hell with our Canadian neighbors. And her sort of big power politics, her relative hawkishness as a foreign policy candidate suggests that she would not see eye to eye with Justin Trudeau on many foreign policy questions, nor would she pause very long to take Canada's interests into considerations. Justin Trudeau may find himself secretly hoping that Trump becomes president.
Well, I'm sure we will be talking about Hillary Clinton at some later date, but thanks for talking about Trump tonight, notwithstanding. Andrew, Jennifer, and Paul, thank you.